The river. I shouldn't have come this far. My heart pounded in my chest as I slashed through the dense underbrush, the smell of damp earth clinging to my skin. The jungle, once a haven of exotic beauty, had twisted into something darker. The trees loomed overhead, their branches reaching like gnarled claws, while the air hung thick with an oppressive weight, damp and stifling. I couldn't remember how long I'd been wandering, days, maybe weeks? Time lost all meaning when every moment bled into the next, an unending cycle of sweat, hunger, and fear. I hadn't seen another human in what felt like forever, but I could sense something else was watching. It started small, shadows moving at the edge of my vision, a rustle of leaves when there shouldn't have been wind. At night the noises would come. Faint whispers that curled around the trees, too soft to understand but loud enough to chill my blood. At first I told myself it was the jungle's natural sounds, animals, insects, wind. But deep down I knew that wasn't it. Something unnatural was here with me. And then I found the river. It appeared suddenly, as if the jungle had parted to reveal its secret. The water was unnaturally still, reflecting the twisted branches overhead like a black mirror. There was no sound of flowing water, no splash of fish or croak of frogs. It was silent, dead silent. I crouched by the bank, peering into the inky depths. My reflection stared back, distorted, eyes hollowed with exhaustion. I reached out, my fingers barely brushing the surface when I saw it. Something moved beneath the water. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, but then it came closer, rising from the depths. Pale, impossibly long fingers stretched toward the surface, twisting and writhing like they had a mind of their own. My heart lurched and I stumbled back, watching in horror as the hand breached the water, followed by another, then a face. The thing that emerged wasn't human, but it wore the shape of one. Its skin was too pale, almost translucent, and its eyes, black hollow voids, locked onto mine. It didn't blink. It didn't breathe. It just stared as if it was studying me, deciding something. Before I could move, more began to rise. One by one, they emerged from the water, their bodies twisting and flowing like they weren't constrained by the laws of flesh. I backed away slowly, my breath shallow, my legs weak with fear. They didn't follow, but their eyes never left me. They just stood at the water's edge, silent, watching. I ran. But I can still feel their gaze, even now. I bolted, heart hammering in my chest, breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The underbrush tore at my legs as I crashed through the jungle, desperate to put as much distance as possible between me and those things. I didn't know what they were, only that they weren't human, and the thought of their hollow eyes following me sent waves of dread through my body. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see them right behind me, but nothing. No movement. They were there though. I could still feel them watching. The river, just a thin sliver through the trees now, lay still as ever, and at its edge they stood. The figures, motionless, their black eyes tracking my every move. No footsteps, no chase, yet they were still there. Always just far enough that I could see them, but never close enough to understand how. It didn't make sense. I should have lost them by now, but they were always there. My breath hitched in my throat as I ran, limbs trembling from exhaustion, fear gnawing at my gut like a ravenous beast. My head spun, the world narrowing down to a tunnel of green and shadow. I had to keep going. I had to. Then I saw it. The house. In the middle of the jungle, there it stood, as if it had always been there, hidden between the trees. I skidded to a halt, staring at it, confusion warring with the cold fear clawing up my spine. The structure was old, ancient even. Its wooden walls were cracked, covered in vines, and the windows were black, gaping holes that stared out at me like eyes. The air around it was wrong, too still, too quiet. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears, but nothing else. Not the wind, not the creatures, nothing. I had never seen this house before. But I had no choice. I could feel them creeping closer, those figures. They were still by the river, but something told me they were waiting. Waiting for me to make a move. I stepped toward the house. As soon as I crossed the threshold, the air grew colder, biting into my skin. The door creaked open with a sound that echoed through the trees, far too loud in the unnatural silence. The inside was dim, shadows crawling along the walls as if they were alive, shifting and twisting. I hesitated for just a moment, but the sense of being watched pressed in on me like a weight, pushing me forward. The door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. The house felt wrong, like it wasn't real, like it was shifting, breathing around me. I backed up, my legs shaking, and stumbled into the main room. The furniture was sparse, covered in a thick layer of dust, as if no one had stepped foot inside for decades. A fireplace stood at the far end, the remnants of a long-dead fire still resting in the grate. But what caught my attention was the sound. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. pacing just outside the house. I crept toward the window, my body frozen with dread. My breath fogged the glass as I pressed my face against it, peering out into the dark jungle. They were there. The creatures, the ones from the river. They hadn't moved. They stood in the clearing just beyond the house, still watching, still waiting. The oddest thing was how they never seemed to get closer no matter how far I ran. But their presence was suffocating. My hands trembled as I backed away from the window, but I didn't dare make a sound. Then the floor creaked. I froze. From somewhere deeper in the house, I heard a soft shuffle, like someone, or something, moving. The darkness in the hallway seemed to throb, a living, breathing thing. The sense of wrongness that clung to this place grew unbearable, thickening the air until every breath felt like swallowing glass. Something was in here with me. The house wasn't empty. The floor groaned beneath me, an ominous creak that echoed through the suffocating silence of the house. I had been standing still, barely daring to breathe, every instinct in my body screaming at me to stay silent, to not make a sound. But the moment stretched too long, the tension too unbearable, and that's when it happened. The floor gave way. I felt the sickening lurch as the rotten wood beneath my feet crumbled. The air was knocked from my lungs as I plunged downward, arms flailing, heart hammering in blind terror. For a split second, I saw the room around me rush past, the broken beams, the dust swirling in the dim light, before everything went dark. I landed hard, the impact rattling my bones. But it wasn't the solid ground that caught me. It was something else. At first, I thought I'd fallen into some sort of web. I struggled to move, but my arms were pinned, my legs tangled. Cold, damp strands wound around my body, tightening as I thrashed. Panic flared hot in my chest as I realized I was trapped, bound in a thick, twisted mesh of vines. They weren't normal vines. These were thick, pulsing, as if alive, slithering over my skin like they had a will of their own. I tried to scream, but the sound died in my throat as the vines coiled tighter, pressing into my flesh. My pulse raced and I writhed in their grip, but it was useless. They were everywhere, clinging to my arms, my legs, even wrapping around my neck, cold and slick like 1,000 hands gripping me all at once. I fought harder, the feeling of the vines crawling against my skin unbearable. Each time I moved, they tightened as if reacting to my struggles. I gasped for air, my chest heaving, but the vines only constricted more, their grip unrelenting. The dim light from above flickered, casting long shadows over the pit I had fallen into. I looked up, hoping, praying, to see an opening, a way out. But the hole I had crashed through was far above me now, just a sliver of light between the rotting floorboards. And then I heard it, the sound. From deep within the house, something was moving. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoed through the walls, growing louder, closer. Whatever it was coming for me. My body seized in terror as the sound drew near, a slow, dragging thud like something heavy was shuffling through the house. I tried to scream, but the vines choked the sound out of me. They twisted around my throat, squeezing just enough to make my vision blur, but not enough to suffocate me completely. It was like they were playing with me, toying with my fear. The footsteps stopped. I could feel its presence now, standing above the hole, just out of sight. The air grew colder, the shadows darker, as if the very house was bending to its will. I tried to twist my neck to see if I could catch a glimpse of whatever was looming over me, but the vines wouldn't let me move. Then I saw it. Something shifted at the edge of the pit, a shadow darker than the rest, impossibly tall. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I was trapped, helpless, tangled in this web of living vines. The shadow leaned closer, just enough that I could see the outline of its face. It wasn't human. Its features were twisted, wrong, an elongated head, eyes that gleamed like wet stones in the dark. It watched me, silent, as if studying its prey. I thrashed harder, desperate to break free, but the more I struggled, the more the vines constricted. Cold sweat dripped down my face as I gasped for breath, my mind reeling with fear. The shadow shifted, extending one long bony hand toward me, its fingers impossibly thin and sharp. The vines reacted to its touch, twitching, tightening. I felt them move under my skin as if burrowing deeper. The pain was unbearable, like thousands of tiny needles stabbing into my flesh. And then, with a slow, deliberate motion, the shadow withdrew. The footsteps receded, leaving me alone in the pit once again. But the vines didn't loosen. They just kept squeezing. And I knew deep down that this wasn't over. Not even close. The vines loosened. At first it was subtle. A slight slackening around my chest, the pressure easing just enough for me to gasp in a lungful of musty air. My body trembled, drenched in cold sweat, every nerve frayed from the crushing grip of those living tendrils. For a fleeting moment I thought it was over. that somehow whatever monstrous force held me had relented. But mercy was not what it had in mind. The vines didn't release me out of kindness. They slithered away, uncoiling with a slow, deliberate motion, like a predator letting its prey think it had escaped, just to enjoy the chase. I was too weak to stand, my limbs trembling as I collapsed onto the damp ground below. My skin tingled where the vines had touched, bruises forming under the tight, unyielding grip they once held. I crawled, scraping at the dirt with bloodied fingernails, desperate to put distance between me and whatever it was that haunted this place. Every inch I moved felt like agony, my muscles screaming in protest, but the fear driving me forward was more powerful than the pain. Above me, the shadow was still there. I could feel its gaze, cold and unblinking, watching from the edge of the pit. It didn't move. It didn't have to. It knew what was coming. And so did I. I stumbled to my feet, my legs weak and unsteady, barely able to hold myself up. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the very atmosphere had turned against me. The jungle outside felt a million miles away, the house closing in around me like a tomb. There was no sound, no life, just the oppressive silence and the soft, ever-present creaking of the house, as if it were breathing along with me. I forced myself to move, each step a battle against the terror gnawing at the edges of my mind. I had to get out. I had to escape before whatever that thing was decided to finish what it started. But as I made my way toward the staircase that led out of the pit, I felt it. The air shifted. It wasn't over. From behind me came a low, guttural growl, a sound that reverberated through the walls, a deep, primal vibration that made my stomach twist with dread. I turned slowly, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run. But when I faced it, my legs locked in place. The creature stepped forward, emerging fully from the shadows. It was worse than I had imagined. Its skin was slick and wet, like something that had crawled out from the depths of a rotting swamp. Its body, long and twisted, hunched over with elongated limbs that dragged across the ground. But it was the face that made my blood freeze. It was almost human, but warped, stretched too thin, with eyes like black pits that seemed to devour the light around them. Its mouth hung open, jagged teeth glinting in the dim light, a sickening grin that promised only death. The creature didn't rush. It didn't need to. It moved with deliberate, terrifying slowness, savoring every moment of my terror. Each step it took, the floorboards beneath it groaned as if protesting the presence of something so unnatural. I backed away, my breath coming in shallow gasps, my body too weak to fight. I reached the staircase, but as I placed my hand on the rail, the wood splintered under my grip, crumbling to dust. I was trapped. The monster stopped just inches from me, its breath rancid, its eyes boring into mine. I could hear it now, low, guttural whispers curling from its throat, words that weren't meant for human ears. The jungle outside seemed impossibly far, the house a labyrinth of despair with no way out. Then with a sudden, sickening jolt, it lunged. I screamed. But before it could reach me, the vines surged up again, wrapping around my legs, my arms, pulling me down. This time they weren't gentle. They yanked me back into the pit, dragging me toward the creature, offering me up like a sacrifice to whatever dark force commanded this place. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me whole was the creature's face, that twisted grin, leaning closer, its breath hot and foul against my skin. No one came to this jungle after that. The locals spoke of it in hushed whispers, calling it cursed ground, a place where the jungle itself was alive with ancient, malevolent spirits. They said anyone who ventured too deep into its heart never returned, swallowed by the earth, claimed by the things that waited in the shadows. The jungle grew wilder, more tangled, until it became impassable, as if the land itself had closed off, sealing its terrible secrets within.